I'm interested in creating this conversation. And I'm planning to create a club, perhaps called The Nature of Time. We will be meeting every night at 9 a.m. every Saturday morning. And we'll try to build up an audience and really get the issues on the table so that we can all be open-minded to listen to different people describe, what they see as the answers to these questions. I think this is perhaps the most important question of our time. It's the most important issue that has not been solved in the last 100 years since relativity and quantum theory have been developed. This is great, and I'm really loving this. But I am going to slide off, and perhaps you might leave me slide into the audience. And I've created a number of other facilitators in this room. So please go on without me if I'm no longer around. Okay, so who would like to go next? Flash your microphone once if you have a question, or multiple times if you have applause.
I'd love to know if there's any female voices that join in the room.
I'd still love to know if there were any other answers to the fundamental question that's on the table that I posed, Paul.
Okay, yes, thank you. Really good question. So I think, was that Ramsey?
This was Daza that posed the question.
Oh, Dasna. Okay, good. Please restate your question so that everyone can be clear.
Yes, what could be possible?
Thank you.
With the breakthroughs that are emerging now, especially looking at time potentially as an emergent property of quantum entanglement, for example, and some of the other things happening just at the edges of our understanding. If there were big breakthroughs such that we finally grokked the nature of time, what might that make possible? For example, could it enable generation of energy somehow, or could it be weaponized? Could it enable tools of types that we don't have now, that we could build things with? What would be possible if only we could finally crack the question of time?
I'll jump in.
Excellent question, Raza. Thank you. Who would like to respond to that? Sky,
I'll jump in. Yeah. So Eliyahu Cohen is a physicist who's done quite a bit of work on entanglement over time, as compared to entanglement in space, which is what most people are more familiar with. Working with the physicist, God, I'm forgetting his name. Well known for the Bohm, Aharonov, working with Aharonov on some papers that include like top-down, looking at the world instead of being built up from the smaller pieces, looking at quantum theory as a theory of the large coming first and the small emerging from it. I'll look up the papers that I'm thinking of, but they just came to mind. And time crystals is another more recent phenomenon that's been discussed, and I don't fully understand the phenomenon, but I think that what these things point to is the possibility of better control of systems over time, especially at the nanoscale, as one possible major benefit of having a better understanding of time. Even just Schrodinger's equation, for instance, when you introduce time dependence to the Hamiltonian, it becomes very complicated to solve. So it's a hang up I think in our ability to really predict the dynamics of systems that are complex. Maybe other people have more information.
Part of the problem with the question that you're asking, Des, is that you're sort of saying, if we had a breakthrough, what would it open up? And of course, what the breakthrough is the major determiner of what would open up. And I don't share the belief that we're necessarily on the verge of a breakthrough on this. But what I would say is, I don't know whether your question is informed by the fact that there's this very strange observable called energy that is bound up with time, which is sort of your question seemed to hint at this, where there is one observable that has a dual role. And in essence, the energy acts as both something to observe about a system, but it also acts as the engine of propagation. And this is bound up with the concept of time. And so, in a certain sense, one thing that you would be almost guaranteed if you had a breakthrough in time is that you would have a breakthrough in your understanding of energy. And you can't really say a ton beyond that until you know which breakthrough you had in understanding time. But for me, it's like a huge question: is time single dimensional, multidimensional, discrete, emergent, blah blah blah? I'm putting down on continuous and multidimensional. But of all of the various things, I would say that every breakthrough in time must entail a breakthrough in energy, from what we know.
Thank you.
Well, it's obvious that
Dr.
time and energy are conjugate variables in quantum theory. So I believe you, Eric. That seems to be a really interesting dimension. Although the fact that you think maybe it's continuous is problematic. The continuum background. John Baez has done a very good paper on the problems of the continuum, which you can get off the archive. And so, one of the things that's happened over centuries now has been this discussion between scientists about the discrete versus the continuum. And at each epoch that we've had in our scientific history, we've always had these opposing views that have been in this dichotomy of like, are things discrete or are things continuous? Do you have any thoughts about that from your new perspectives?
Well, I guess what I would say is that you never know when you're at the complete end of a story of physics, but you can sort of say that you may be at the end of a chapter where everything is sort of a piece and comes to a conclusion. You have situations where the continuous can be an approximation to the discrete, and where the discrete can be an approximation to the continuum. So the world in which I live, I think very highly of the possibility that the map will eventually be the territory between calculus, linear algebra, manifold theory, and whatever it is. In other words, that the universe is made of math, which this is somewhat associated with Max Tegmark for reasons that I'm not entirely clear about, sort of a Platonic Platonist position. But I guess my take on it is that I am so moved by the representation space, the continuum groups, the Lie algebra, the differential operators, all of these things, is that even if life turns out, or the world turns out to be ultimately discrete in some deep sense, this chapter will almost certainly conclude with the continuum. And then whether or not the end of the chapter brings you to a new chapter where we start to say, well, what generated the continuum, and is this really the fundamental level? That's a different question. But what I will say is I have no desire to try to say, why is there something rather than nothing? What I do want to say is if the something that exists has the simple properties of being differentiable and amenable to linear algebra, then it would be great if a very simplistic beginning, and by beginning I don't mean in time, I mean in some sort of procedural order, an ordinal procedural order, that thing could be as simple as a four-dimensional manifold with a tiny amount of structure on it, which would be necessary to birth what appears to be three families of flavor chiral fermions with all of the forces, this very sort of peculiar pattern of numbers. I keep thinking about doing something I would call rational physics, to predict not the things that physicists usually predict, but like why do we think we see three families? Why is the weak force switched on for left-handed matter, right-handed antimatter, and not be kind of even-handed about things? Why do we have the particular internal quantum number assignments, which tend to be given by rational numbers? So, I believe that a lot of that comes out of the continuum. And whatever Paul's perspective is, I don't want to say fundamentally that I don't believe that the world is not discrete. What I want to say is it's not discrete in this chapter, and I don't see reasons to think that this chapter isn't the end of the book. I think that's a careful statement. It's a bold statement. It leaves room for Paul, but I'm also not going to back off the fact that I think that almost all the evidence that we have suggests that it's pulling very hard towards the continuum with the presence of differential calculus, Lie groups, and things that appear to be smooth. I think what we can't say is that in the case of the Einstein equations, let's put that forward, that the presence of singularities in the fundamental solutions indicates that we have an effective theory that is of continuous and differentiable type, where the solutions do not have the property of being completely of continuous and differentiable type, which probably means that we're dealing with effective theories and solutions that break down. But I think that when you find the ultimate theories which recover these as effective theories, you will still be within the continuum paradigm. I think Paul's got a lot of work to replace, and spiritually, Stephen Wolfram as well, to replace some of what we perceive as the continuum with the discrete. In Stephen's case, you could imagine a discrete set of instructions giving rise to an effective continuum. I don't know what Paul would do, but he's here so he can tell us.
Well, thank you. I'm trying to be more of a facilitator here than I am a proponent of any particular idea. So just so everyone knows in this room, I started this room as a pure experiment to just try to learn the UI. This is the first room I've ever created, and I was planning to create a room, or actually a series of rooms on a club on this topic of the nature of time. And so I'm not wanting to go deeply into proposing any particular response, especially since Eric's eloquent response, deserves something perhaps more than I'm capable of right now. But Eric, it sounds to me rather like your notion of seemed to be very reminiscent of what Garrett Lacey is talking about in his Lie group E8 hypothesis. Can
That
you
son of a bitch.
compare? That's him, yes. Would you like to comment on that
Well, no. Just
relationship?
Garrett. Garrett, and I have chosen to become arch nemeses of each other. The thing about Garrett's work is that I think people don't appreciate from a phenomenological point of view how many things Garrett has been trying to incorporate. He's the inverse of me, effectively. What he does is to start from the most singular object in the world, E8 in some sense, and then to try to recover the world's complexity by looking at the Baroque complexity of E8, which is a miracle in 248 dimensions, and then breaking it down into a four-dimensional world with, a bunch of spinners, three families because of triality inside of E8. And he does a tremendous amount of interesting stuff. I don't think it works, but I think that the idea of taking something singular and trying to recover the world as a consequence of that is different than what I do, which is to start off with the simplest possible thing, which I analogize to a fertilized egg and hoping for a human being, which doesn't make any sense except through some process of bootstrapping. So reducing something that is intrinsically Baroque to get the complexity of our world, or building up the Baroque complexity through a bootstrap, are in some sense inverse processes. But it's that mirroring which I really quite appreciate about Garrett. And I just will point out something. Physics community has been really fucking shitty to Garrett. And I may say that, that bastard, but he and I are having fun with it. It's really a shame that people who haven't been bold enough to put through their own theory of the world take the piss out of Garrett. Yeah, he's made a bunch of errors, but he's also owned up to them. And I think that he's really inventive. He works with Cartan connections in order to get, this sort of marriage between the extra variables and the space-time variables. I think that he's tried to understand the theory of super connections introduced by Dan Quillen, to make sure that he doesn't end up in a bosonic paradigm by starting with the Lie group, which I think was his original problem, that E8 is built up from something called semi-spin 16, which is sort of like the rotations of 16-dimensional space, but you lift to the spinners and then you quotient out by a different Z2 subgroup, and then you add in this 16-dimensional Majorana Weyl fermions to get E8. And the great danger was that Garrett's theory was so unified to begin with that all the work he was putting into getting the fermions in the form of spinners was going to mean that when he quantized, he was going to be in a Bose-Einstein paradigm and he wasn't going to have room for Fermi-Dirac statistics. And now he's trying to do something with superconnections to make sure that spin 1/2 stays Fermi and integral spin stays Bose. I think you've got to give Garrett a lot of credit, even if his stuff just doesn't work. And, again, who am I to say other than his competitor? But quite honestly, the theoretical physics community needs to be either more adventurous and put up something more interesting than string theory or loop quantum gravity, or leave people like Garrett to develop their theories in front of us all. And I personally feel that he did much better on the phenomenological front than just about any string theorist.
So just a quick full disclosure here. Garrett's a friend of mine. He's on the advisory board of my company, and when he comes to the Bay Area, he stays at my house and has a room there. We've known each other for many years, but I do agree with some of the characterization that Eric has here, because I've had some of these arguments with Garrett, and he's a way better physicist than I am. I'm much more of a computer scientist these days. But I've always found that the statement here is that Garrett has a tremendous amount of courage. And let's put this on the on the table here also for you, Eric, too. I mean, putting yourself out there and thinking differently and having the courage to go against the status quo is actually the way that fundamental paradigm shifts happen in our world. And Einstein did that, and many other famous physicists did this. And so I don't know yet. I always remain open-minded to whatever Garrett is about to say. And as you know, I've remained open-minded with what you've had to say in the past when we've met. And so I'm fascinated here with the idea that Clubhouse is a not just an app, but as a platform, can help us create the kind of conversations in the right kind of way that we haven't been able to do on any other platform. And I'm really encouraged by the opportunity here to bring different communities together to discuss these very, very important issues. And my personal belief is that I wish computer scientists would talk more to physicists when they try to think about the nature of time and causality, because I do think there are some very practical problems that need to be solved in distributed systems. And Stephen Wolfram, who I also know, has recently made some very profound discoveries about the nature of time with his abstract rewriting systems. And only just like 2 or 3 days ago, he held a conference. He's done an extraordinarily good job of bringing in some people to try to discover the intricacies of the consensus problem, for example, not just for blockchain, but for the whole consensus problem itself, which is a very deep problem in computer science. So I'm just admiring what's going on here in our society and all these people with courage who are willing to stand their ground, even though they have tremendous attacks from the rest of the community. So my hat's off to you, Eric, for standing your ground and
Well,
the
no,
kind
no.
of
Look, I'm just a podcaster and an entertainer. I'm not a physicist. Garrett has a PhD in physics. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but quite honestly, thank you very much, Paul, for the kind words. I think what's really going on is that we've come to the end of something, and we're in elite overproduction mode. We've got a lot of people playing the academic Hunger Games who've been taught to savage each other before we actually evaluate what each other is saying. And the fact that I appear with Stephen, I appear with Garrett, and I appear with people like Frank Wilczek, dealing with in the present is the legacy of, and the sociological legacy of string theorists in a declining environment of physics power. And in large measure, this is the world's most successful intellectual community. And it's fallen on extremely hard times. So imagining a very rich family that hasn't been able to earn a living for about 50 years. And then you have the fundamental theoretical physics community. And I think that the goal of people like Garrett and myself and Stephen is to get it healthy again. And you get it healthy by teaching people not to savage people with new ideas. There's sort of an industry of taking down people who threaten string theory or loop quantum gravity or any of these large programs that I have to say, I think the string theorists were far more aggressive than any other group I've ever seen because they thought they had it. And they made the mistake of taking a huge series of victory laps around 1984, 86. They were so excited it was all going to be finished very quickly. And they made the mistake, of course, of trying to put everybody else to the sword. And what was their claim? Well, in a certain sense, there's certain technical aspects of quantum field theory that I think that the string theorists really understood better than everybody else. You know, they're brilliant people and they come out of the quantum field theory tradition. And those technical aspects are not taken sufficiently seriously by the rest of the physics community, I think. And so issues of renormalizability and gravity and all of these things, I think played very, very heavily. We had very smart people who were far too aggressive. So they were the most intellectually interesting community. I think that their prowess in geometry shows just how good they are. And the fact that they couldn't get it to work in actual physics is sort of this completely ironic O. Henry-like twist. And that's left the community with too many people, elite overproduction, too few jobs, too few positions. We've had our funding cut. My goal is to take some of the sons of bitches in the physics community and get them paid and get them, you know, situations in which they can live and thrive and have fun and do what we've asked of them. And, you know, the funny part about this, Paul, is that all of these slings and arrows tend to come from people who are hurting professionally. And that the old saying that you learn in prison, that hurt people, I think is also something you learn in theoretical physics. Hurt people. And the reason that the community is so fucking nasty and so petty and bitter and all of that is in part that it's lost confidence in itself. We have these super ancestors like Dirac and Einstein and Yang who are able to do everything. And now we have this question of like, well, why doesn't our stuff work? We're clearly incorporating such brilliant stuff like supersymmetry and grand unified theory. How come this doesn't translate? And, you know, I think what's really important is to recognize that we've got to get the political economy of physics back together so that this doesn't require bravery. The only reason it requires bravery to stand up here is we've got so many fucking hurt, angry people here that are out to savage every new idea. And when Garrett, for example, couldn't drag 3 generations out of E8 and couldn't quantize the fermions differently from the bosons, that wasn't like a death knell to his theory. It's just like, okay, you took on technical debt. So this is your new technical debt. And I really hope that computer scientists shove the concept of technical debt down the throats of the theoretical physics community that tries to destroy everyone who deviates from one of the big programs. So I think it should require a lot less courage. I'm just a happy podcaster, not a theoretical physicist, and so I'm in a much different position than Garrett. But I think Garrett's courage is really admirable. He's tried to live out of a van. He bet it all on Apple stock. He's made some money. And what we need more physicists with fuck you money. And if that fuck you money doesn't come from the government, it's got to come from private individuals or the market, or we have to steal it. But we've got to fundamentally get people jobs and dignity and work and data and access so that they stop savaging each other. It's like a bunch of crabs eating each other in a bucket and pulling anyone that tries to escape back down. So thank you very much, Paul, but I really think that the big problem is our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents didn't provide for us. It's time to go out and either earn, invent, or steal what we need so that we stop seeing the academic Hunger Games make this into an issue of courage at all. But thanks very much.
Alex, I'd love to get your
Beautiful,
perspective
thank you.
of some of the comments that Eric made, given that you're a young string theorist yourself.
I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I literally just want to excite people about good science. I think everything Eric is saying is very valuable. And I do deeply, string theory deeply excites me, and a lot of other ideas deeply excite me. I think that there are tons of things about the community that could be better. But I also, I didn't even come in to study string theory. I came in because of exactly being inspired by Eric, actually, and other people that talked about the need for new ideas. And I sort of, actually, the more I learned about string theory, the more I kind of, and this is a contrasting opinion. Everyone's allowed their own opinion. But the more I learned about string theory, I'm like, this is it. Oh no, this is literally it.
I think that's awesome, Alex, by the way. Just let me be clear about it. The problem wasn't string theory, the subject matter. It was string theory, the 1980s sociological phenomenon. And if you came after the 1980s, I remember running into, Nima and Juan and company, and they didn't know the history. They had to look to Natty Seiberg. This was at an Institute for Advanced Study event. The community was just in a triumphalist mode. And triumphalist communities, whether it's Bitcoin when Bitcoin is going up, or it's neoclassical economists, or it's the neo-Darwinians, are always obnoxious. And you don't fault a community for being obnoxious if it's getting it done. Because, it's a sort of a negative externality of success. The really painful thing is to watch a community, and this again is not true of today's string theorists quite so much, putting to the sword their competitors because they've already granted themselves, they've taken a huge advance because they know that they are going to be the ones to solve the theory of everything. That arrogance has not been in evidence in this form as easily since at least the year 2000, 2005. So if you're coming in now, this has nothing to do with you, really.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. I think we have bad branding these days. Like, my friend Zach is on Clubhouse quite a bit, and he did his PhD, and when people ask him what he did his PhD on, he'll say string theory formally. But again, he did this in like 2015, 2017. He didn't really, it's a totally different type of physicist than like you're saying, than the string theorists of the 80s and 90s that you're talking about. He, of course, took inspiration from the ideas in string theory that were deeply, seeing something about gravity that we should be drawing a lesson from. But then he also took inspiration from all sorts of different ideas in quantum information, etc. And he's a very heterogeneous, balanced physicist that I really admire. And I think there are, oh, go ahead.
The thing I was going to say is if you think about the ADS-CFT result, the old idea was that string theory could do what gauge theory could not. So when you have a duality between string theory and gauge theory, that was a weirdly sort of a blow to string triumphalism, even if it wasn't a blow to string theory. So even the result of Maldacena and, let's say, the tenor of Ed Witten. Ed Witten in the modern day does not look like Ed Witten in 1984. You have no idea what 1984 Ed Witten looks like unless you find old footage. And it was astounding. I should just say that we all got swept up in the idea that an alien had emerged from the cosmos who was in touch with a substrate of reality that the rest of us couldn't imagine. I look back at Ed's papers, I've never seen an intellectual feat remotely close to what that man pulled off. And, there was a tiny number of voices that took the great achievement of this generation was not string theory. That's the irony. It was that they figured out what quantum field theory actually was as a mathematical discipline having nothing to do with the physical world. That achievement is going to be, if they don't actually translate this into physics, the idea, it's like finding calculus inside of physics and then realizing that it applies to everything. Well, we didn't know that quantum field theory applied to anything other than the physical world.
Yeah.
That's a shock.
Yeah. And now we see that it applies to phase transitions, to condensed matter systems,
Well,
to
or to Bourdism and
boardisms.
extraordinary cohomology theory. So that's really kind of,
Yeah.
it appeared to be a grab bag of techniques. If you think about something like the triangle anomaly and things that were understood in perturbation theory were found to be fundamental and geometric.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that I think that the best of the string theorists, and it was very few of them, pulled off something that when we finally pull back and see what they did, yes, it wasn't the theory of everything, but it was the most brilliant failure anybody has ever done, because they didn't succeed in quantizing gravity, which would be to quantize geometry. They geometrized the quantum, so it backfired exactly. And the backfiring was one of the most spectacular intellectual feats we've ever witnessed.
It's really interesting to hear your take on it, because I really agree with you up until that, that last claim about, I see it as they thought strings were fundamental, but what they found was things were much richer than they were expecting.
Well,
There are membranes, there is holography, and somehow all of this is captured by the universal properties of conformal field theory at large and alone. And this seems like a beautiful result that is connecting disparate parts of physics that it's not, so yes, string theory on its own, if you claim this is all there is, that's a mistake. But you're seeing it's connecting these ideas and these diverse concepts in physics in a way that definitely, it's
Hey
good that
guys,
they investigated further.
hey guys, can you hear me?
Go ahead. Who is
Go ahead.
speaking? Who is speaking? Do you have a question? Please announce yourself, who you are, and then what you'd like to contribute.
I'd like to hear what Alex has to say. I want to hear him finish his point.
Yeah, I would do.
Well,
All
it's
right,
just,
that's a good point. Let's go ahead and do that. So, who is the person who spoke so I can remember you? What's your name?
she may have left. I'm not
I
sure.
think,
I
I
think
think
that's
they
a
left.
troll.
It may have
All
been a
right.
troll. That was
That
a
was
troll. I
Right.
think.
other.
Let's assume that was a troll. Okay, let's go back and let's hear what Alex has to say. And thank you.
well, I'm not even saying anything so much as trying to gain maybe an alternative perspective of things, because I'm surrounded by string theorists, and of course it's easy to think of things as we are seeing more and more exciting things about the nature of space-time, and there are these matrix models that we were talking about earlier by Susskind and Schenker and others, the BFSS matrix models, that really you can see something like space-time emerging from these discrete statistics of the eigenvalues of large random matrices. And that seems to me like they really are seeing something about quantum geometry. Or from the worldsheet perspective, you have this deep connection between the renormalization group equations of Wilson and Einstein's equations that the string worldsheet connects. And to me, that is quantum geometry. And at the same time, there is a lot of work on geometric quantization that Witten and others have done in the 80s. But I'm
geometric
curious.
quantization is a reserved term, so let's be very careful that originates, I think, more in the 70s, maybe even late 60s,
Yes.
to explain effectively that the symplectic form used in Hamiltonian mechanics should be better thought of as a curvature form of a line bundle from which sections are drawn to generate the states of a quantum theory. What Witten did on top of that was not effectively geometric quantization, but geometric quantum field theory with the help of Michael Atiyah guiding and Graham Siegel, and then somehow Dan Quillen gets into the action. That story, is very different from the perspective. Again, I am agreeing with you about quantizing geometry and geometrizing the quantum. I think we did geometrize the quantum. The quantum is now more geometric than general relativity ever was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's thanks to these people who identify as string theorists, but who may have actually contributed mostly as geometers, geometrizing function spaces of infinite dimensions. Now,
Yes.
but the point, where do you think we disagree, Alex?
It's more like I would love to hear your perspective. I don't even think we disagree. I mean, especially on the sociological aspects and things. I would like to gain your perspective, sort of. There are a bunch of constructions in string theory that, to me, actually are capturing quantum aspects of Einstein's theory. They really are quantizing the geometry. For me, again, the large N matrix models are doing this for me. Or if I gave you a conformal field theory with a parameter n that I take to be large, I see something that looks like a semi-classical space-time that satisfies Einstein's equations. And then if I take n to be not so large, I can, see something like a quantum geometry forming that isn't well described by the classical group theory that we normally think about. You see things like quantum groups emerging, etc. Um, and similarly, the thing that really compelled me and excited me about string theory is that studying a two-dimensional conformal field theory that lives on the world sheet of the string, the reason that theory needs to be conformal is for the reparametrization of the string world sheet. But if you will, and that's for it to propagate in a fixed classical coherent space-time background. But if you allowed the theory on the world sheet to be non-conformal, there's still a meaningful interpretation of this as allowing the space-time to go off shell and not satisfy Einstein's equations. And so by going away from a renormalization group fixed point in the sense of Wilson, you are going away from satisfying classical gravity in the sense of Einstein. And this is, to me, this is quantizing geometry. And I'm curious what your take is on that, or what you think you would like to see beyond that, or what you would be excited to see, uh, alternatively or more of, or something like this.
Well, I mean, again, I want to make sure that the room has a chance to do whatever the room wants to do. So I'm happy to answer. I'm also happy to not answer. So up to the room.
Derailed. Yeah.
I since I started this room, I'd like to hear what Eric has to say. I always find it interesting, and I think it's on topic. So I'm happy with continuing with Eric's description here. If anyone else has a question to ask or a contribution to make, I'm monitoring the app to see people flashing their mic. So people flashing their mic quickly, I think that's applause. Anyone who flashes it once, I will treat that as a question. So Eric, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I think, Alex, maybe to the extent that there is a difference, and I'd love to have one because it'd be fun to explore.
Definitely.
Is that I took a huge lesson from the fact that quantum field theory provides a natural enhancement of extraordinary cohomology theory. And it's not a good look for physics. The problem is, once you show the quantum field theory isn't about the physical world, it's about general systems, one of which may be the ingredients that give us the physical world, you now have to ask yourself the question, oh shit, the fact that something makes sense inside of this doesn't mean that we're connecting physics to physics. It means that we may be connecting mathematics to mathematics. So all the beauty of string theory, and I think Brian Greene recently commented on this, saying that maybe in the future string theory will be done in mathematics departments. Maybe quantum field theory will become the province of mathematics departments, and the physics departments will ultimately only concern themselves with the particular quantum field theory that results in the physical universe. Now, when it comes to these issues about recovering space-time and all these issues and eigenvalues of matrices, you're probably more up on what is currently being discussed than I am. I've been out for about 25 years and check in occasionally, and never in physics. But what I would say is that there are all sorts of things that allow you to see indications of that you're on the right track. But we don't know which of these indications is right. For example, is there a particular theory of why we see three generations? When I started this game, it was because there was a Calabi-Yau manifold at every point in space and time that had a topology where its index theory coughed up three generations. And then people would find multiple ways to generate three generations. The issue with why is it called string theory if there's so many brains in it? And the answer is that at the beginning, people had an explanation why brains wouldn't exist. It's not that nobody thought, well, if you've gone to extended objects, why don't you have extended objects of every dimension? There were actually reasons given why only strings mattered. And that's why it was named string theory rather than something more appropriate. So in part, the curse of having quantum field theory become a branch of mathematics rather than physics is that, of course, you'd start to expect to see the physical universe emerging from everywhere, because now you've actually connected to the main, the mother lode of great mathematics. So I think that it cuts in a different way. Also, the richness that you're talking about is definitely a plus, but it's also weirdly a huge loss. When we thought that there were a finite number of theories to investigate, um, the idea was we could just go down a finite list and eliminate all of the ones that aren't right, and it's going to be one of them. And then when Ed coughed up this idea of a continuum of theories, and these were the extreme points, suddenly we lost the idea that this could be enumerated, and we could just hand different theories to different people. Remember the Glashow story that Schwinger had assigned him SU2 for his thesis or something like that, and so, in a weird way, string theory succeeded in making itself look much less compelling as a fundamental explanation. And this is part of the paradox, and why I think also why we all appear so unfamiliar to each other, depending upon which era we passed through, because the eras didn't have the same feel. I don't know how to recreate how exciting and completely psychotic the era of string triumphalism was, because nobody'd ever seen anything like it. My favorite story from this is that I'm sitting, I think in 1984, next to a person at an Ed Whitten lecture at Penn, and Ed says in his inimitable voice, "Well, as every quantum field theorist knows," and then he proceeds to say something, and the guy jabs me in the ribs who's sitting next to me. He says, "I've been a quantum field theorist all my life, and I don't know any of this stuff," and it was very much, boys being boys playing their games of, well, as every quantum field theorist knows what nobody knew. It was really exciting, but it was also incredibly intimidating, and the intimidation was used towards a terrible end. So I think what I'm hoping to see, to be blunt, is I want to see physics go back to physics. My particular madness is that I believe that the Standard Model has things to teach geometers, and that's not a typical viewpoint. What we usually think is that geometry allows a very efficient expression of field theoretic equations, and it's great by making sure that we don't have pseudo tensors in our equations. It keeps us honest. It does lots of bookkeeping for us. But most people don't believe that the Standard Model, with all of its peculiarities, is particularly geometrically important. Maybe because of anomaly cancellation, it's got a little bit of constraints on which groups can be used and which representations can occur. But it's not thought to be a natural looking model, particularly the Higgs sector, which is ironically visually very geometric through its use of the quartic potential with the Mexican hat shape. But it doesn't really have a good sort of Steenrod, Arasmanian bundle theoretic interpretation. So what my belief is, and what geometric unity is based upon, is that the particular aspects of the quarks, hadrons and leptons, and the force particles, is actually telling us about geometry at a bundle theoretic level that we don't know. We already did a lot of the hard work. I don't think that quantum is as interesting as it used to be post geometric quantization. We should now expect the quantum any place that we have Hamiltonian mechanics. You can choose to forego it if you want to, but I don't think that the quantum is as surprising as it used to be. And by the same token, I think that post the Wu-Yang dictionary, which is really not Wu and Yang, but it's kind of Simons and Yang, I think that we have a geometric bundle theoretic basis in Arrowsmanian geometry for the standard model, the way that Riemann provided the substrate for Einstein and Grossman's general relativity. So I think that that's a really, we got almost everything down, and we're now at the last move. And I believe that the reason that the last move is so much harder than any move before this is actually conceptual. How does a fire light itself? How does the universe get started? How do you get everything from almost nothing? And I think that that conceptual problem was much harder than people imagined. The problem with the string theory and quantum field theory community is that they view beauty and they view success through something like perturbation expansion terms and renormalization terms, and can we push something to become non-perturbative? If I think about, for example, the act, non-abelian localization would be a good example. More or less, we have something in the Feynman path integral. This goes back to the issue of time, where we don't exactly know how to physically interpret a calculational heuristic that gives us something like the right answer, but on the other hand, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Should we interpret those terms as if they're actually the particle proceeding along, every possible eventuality with a complex weight? I don't know. What we do find, though, is that in non-abelian localization, that you can have something that you write down that doesn't make sense, like the Feynman path integral, and then it turns out to reduce to simply the classical approximation on the nose. If we live in a very special universe, then some of the garbage that we've been dragging around for decades may be going away. That's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to. Is I'm really looking forward to getting back to actual quarks and leptons, to getting back to 3+1 and 4 dimensions, and the real problems of our physical universe. And I want to have a period of, 5 years where physicists are forced not to play with toy models every day of their research lives, and they're actually forced to confront the actual physical world, where we start by getting some people into math departments to do quantum field theory, because the quantum field theory that they're doing is not physical quantum field theory. I think that these are very important things. We will not get them done, however, as long as we have this generation, and this is my last piece of sociology. Remember that the string theory is, for the most part, a baby boomer phenomena. It arose in response to certain sorts of issues, both scientific and economic and sociological. It re-arose in the 1980s. And I think that when this group of people is gone, it may be sad, but I don't think that you're going to see a reconstruction of Qumran Vafa, Ed Witten, Joe Polchinski, et cetera. It's going to be a very, very different feel when this leadership is no longer at the helm.
Did you know it's Witten's last couple of months at IAS? He's about to turn 70.
I know he's about to turn 70. I've remarked that 1951 is the dividing line between Wilczek and Witten, where Wilczek was the last person to get on the train that everybody agrees is physics at the fundamental level. They're separated by months in that year. I didn't know that Ed Witten was going to be retiring from IAS, but keep in mind that Ed Witten is simply Ed Witten could be just on a beach, and that would be one of the most important research departments on Earth, even if he hadn't done anything in 20 years.
Definitely. This has been super fun to hear your perspective.
Alex, I would love to connect with you offline too. There's things I could also say that I would prefer not to say in an open room.
Yes, I would be happy to as well. You can write me on Twitter if you like, or also on Twitter, or otherwise I can give you my email, my personal email.
Come find me in my DM. Send me your email. We'll start from there.
Yeah, right. I'll
Thanks,
go with
Alex.
that. Thank you. And I'm going to go to bed. So thank you, Paul, for the fantastic room.
Thanks, Alex.
Can I hop in and just say something?
Yes, please.
Okay. So actually, I have a question for Eric. It looks like Alex has hopped out. But just a quick point. It was so it felt so nurturing to hear you talk about the take no prisoners culture, because as you know, Eric, I washed up at MIT when you were there, but you probably don't know that I was a casualty of that culture. And in fact, when you told me that people had been making announcements of results that they had discovered and proved, but that they jumped the gun, that's what happened to me. So, you mentioned the non-abelian localization formula. Actually, I proved the non-abelian localization theorem to Simon Donaldson in his office in 1993. And that was one of the 2 papers that got accepted into annals for my thesis. But because other people had already kind of postulated the existence of this and shown how this would prove something, but they didn't have the theorem, they didn't know how to prove it, they waited for my result, or they couldn't do anything until my result came in. But then when my result came in, they kind of buried the fact that my 2 results were necessary to prove their thing. And so it kind of got, everything got covered over, and it looked like a kind of an accidental side effect that had never occurred to me, when in fact proving some of these results on moduli spaces was my aim all along. And I just was completely confused, like, what? I thought this was a collective pursuit. How can people be so mean and so unkind to someone who's just kind of trying to collaborate? But I kind of consider that it was a lucky escape, because I started looking around for a more collaborative environment and a kind of a space where I could have ideas. And Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, and this whole kind of mathematical way of thinking about the evolution of human cognition, which just seemed to be this entire kind of world that was being unexplored by people with a kind of a mathematical bent. It just was like, well, there it is, a new continent, no one's playing there, go and have fun. So it was actually kind of, in retrospect, the best thing that could have happened. But now I come back to this.
Beautiful.
I
Thank you,
come
Sean.
back to this. Thank you. I come back to this kind of having, spent a lot of time thinking about how people think and how people get trapped in a kind of a local maximum of kind of concepts that seem to form a coherent set because you can reason about the relationships between them, but that they don't actually address the underlying pictures. And I think about Einstein. So, he walked around with a bunch of anomalies in his head. And he kind of, didn't just take on any random anomalous experiment. He was taking on the fact that, the Maxwell's equations didn't transform and look the same from kind of any inertial frame of reference, whereas Newton's laws did. Then he was walking around with Stokes' rule of photoluminescence and the photoelectric effect and the ionization of gases by ultraviolet light. And he just kept walking around for years with those in his head. So that was the first move. What are the anomalous things that you really just have to take seriously? And then the second thing he did was he became super sensitive to the possibilities that some of the concepts that we kind of take for granted, that don't even present themselves as a concept to be questioned, like just time just is, or the medium that electromagnetic radiation is a vibration of obviously just is. And when you read Maxwell's lectures on ether, luminiferous ether, or Kelvin's or Michelson's, it's clear that they've just assumed that the ether just is, rather than kind of seeking any alternate concepts, rather than questioning the idea that this is a concept and we could try and find different ones. And so I guess I would love to kind of ask, do you think that there's kind of anomalous evidence that should really be being taken seriously, but somehow is just kind of pushed out of the room and not considered? And then also, are there candidates for the kind of concepts that maybe don't present themselves as concepts, but should be kind of maybe dug into or questioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is, if I understand your question, let me make sure that I do. So correct me. We don't accept the anomalies. So let me just say what I think that they are. The first anomaly I think that we don't accept is what the heck is going on with SO10, which should be called spin 10 grand unified theory. And I don't even think spin 10 grand unified theory is correct. I think it's wrong. But the coincidence of fitting all of the observed particles into a spinor representation of a group whose reason for being, whose defining representation, whose raison d'etre is 10-dimensional space. We don't see the 10-dimensional space, but we have all the quarks and leptons fitting into this representation beautifully. We don't put somebody, I've never seen it, should do an analysis of how unlikely it is that you would get that fit. The idea that the universe is chiral, unless it has a chiral start, as it would in let's say Garrett's theory, where E8 has a particular chirality because it's built out of semi-spin 16 with Weyl spinors, and so the presence of Weyl spinors means that it has an inherently chiral nature. You have to explain chirality, and I think that very often what I find is that the modern generation doesn't find any of this stuff particularly interesting. Like, okay, why 3 generations? Could be anything. Why 16 particles? Why these quantum numbers? Why these assignments? Why the Higgs sector? I don't know. It's just like that. And I think Feynman was flirting with this stuff, trying to be a contrarian. And this generation that sort of believes in crazy ideas like antinatalism just believes that, yeah, this doesn't demand explanation. So I think that the bizarre pattern of 3 generations of flavor chiral fermions falling into these multiplets is so insane that you have to treat it as an anomaly. And in my case, I've decided that I don't think the world is chiral. I think that it is emergently chiral. And I don't think there are 3 generations. People say, oh, do you think that there are 4? And I say, no, I think that there are 2. Because nobody bothered to check. Do you believe that if these generations behave the same way at low energy, that they will continue to behave in exactly the same way to each other as at high energy? That's a different statement. So low energy, yeah, that's effectively you have 3 generations, but I think you only have 2 fundamental generations. I think that the question of why supersymmetry does so many great things and yet fails to appear, if you think about the smell of that, the smell is that it's a misinstantiation of a concept. The concept wouldn't exist unless it wanted to be used in a certain sense, kind of by a Chekhov reasoning, which of course is technically illegal in physics, but all of the best physicists use totally illegal reasoning like beauty. So given that there are no cops, it's time to break the law. I think that these things are tremendously important and exciting, and I think that the biggest problem that we have is that we imagine that our ancestors have been through all of this stuff and they got it. Alan Guth once said to me, I said to him, why are you guys so confident that you're going to find the Higgs boson way back when? And he said, well, there's an unwritten rule that we don't teach people. And I said, what is that? He said, well, if you have the world's smartest people trying to figure out something and they only come up with one way of doing it and they spend 4 or 5 years looking for other alternatives, we assume that it must be correct. I thought, oh, wow, what a piece of metaphysics, if you will. I think that effectively our people goofed. I think one of the things that they goofed about, which I'll be quite open about, is that they used the wrong affine space. You should have implemented supersymmetry on a different affine space than Minkowski space. They spend way too much time in idealized conditions, knowing that gravity is present, pretending that you can work off of a world without gravity in flat space. I think that there are all sorts of things that are blocking our progress, but the big problem is that you need to free your mind. I think Feynman does a beautiful job in the Tau Theta puzzle chapter in one of his popular books of talking about how much courage it takes to believe in something. And what Einstein did very differently than his contemporaries of Lorentz or Poincaré or Minkowski is to say, this I believe. And I think if you want to try out UFOs at the moment. do you want to be the person who says, I think that UFOs are actually aliens? It's a sure way to get people's attention if you have a PhD from a reasonable place and it's a serious subject. But do you want to be the guy who's first off of the ice shelf? Is that the penguin that you think you are? I think Einstein was a person who lived his convictions. One of the things I found most beautiful is, I can't find the quote for you right now, but he says something like, I cannot know whether the good Lord is playing a trick on me and leading me down the garden path. And I love the fact that he wrote so freely to his friends to share his misgivings, his uncertainties, but effectively he lived what the equations told him was most likely at a time when that was richly rewarded. And I think if you lived that in a different era, you would become convinced, for example, that spin 10 grand unified theory was true. Maybe you would have thought that proton decay in an SU5 mediated theory would have to be found. So people have been punished for generations for doing what Einstein did, falling in love with supersymmetry, falling in love with SU5, falling in love with all sorts of things that they shouldn't, that have borne no fruit, string theory included. At the level of actual physics, certainly bore fruit to get us to think about geometry. And I think that that's a very weird morality tale where we have to understand that sometimes what gets you to the winner's circle varies. I think that if you look at the renormalization revolution, you would have to say that it was a conservative revolution. And the reason that it was blocked from all of the people who'd participated in relativity in the quantum years earlier is that those guys, when they were young, did radical stuff. And then when they got old, they thought they should continue to do radical stuff. People don't become conservative as they age necessarily. If they've been rewarded for being radicals, they'll stay radical their whole lives. And that's why Schwinger and Feynman, in a weird way, were conservative in Tominaga, and Dyson. And in so doing, it shows that in some eras you need to be wilder, some you need to be more conservative, sometimes you need to shut up and calculate, sometimes you need to be philosophical. The key question for our era is, what era are we in? And I think we are in an Einsteinian-like era. And I think we're supposed to go back to doing certain thought experiments. Great question. My claim is 3 generations, flavor chiral, this assignment with things working so beautifully in spin 10 multiplets with supersymmetry, seemingly doing so many wonderful things, failing to appear in the real world. You cannot swing a cat without hitting an anomaly in current physics. And that's what you should carry around in your head.
Can I jump in here?
Love that so much. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for interesting conversation.
Go ahead.
So I would love to make sure we invite, from a moderating point of view, invite a variety of voices here. Just make sure everyone feels welcome to join, especially we've heard a lot of male voices today, so female voices are welcome. I had a thought experiment. Bringing this back to time, I think is of interest. It's something we could do here. The nature of time. A thought experiment that's been on my mind, and I've his imagination of catching up to a light beam, and the result of special relativity when something is at the speed of light is that when something goes closer to the speed of light is that time dilates for the surrounding reference frames, and space contracts. And the asymptotic limit of this is that if something was to go at the speed of light, then that contraction of space would happen all the way, and time would dilate all the way. So they would become essentially not useful measures of any kind. But it's not a case that we really talk about because nothing can go the speed of light. But when we think about light actually traveling from light itself, traveling from point to point, say from the sun to the Earth, which is an 8 light minute distance, then in my understanding, the light itself, the phase of the light does not actually change, and the light doesn't evolve in that process. Light can't be said to travel in some sense in its own it's hard to, you can't use phrases like in its own frame because it doesn't have a frame, but there's a sense in which time doesn't, the interval is a null interval, which means that the distance it travels is equivalent to the space, to the time that it takes. And so these cancel out and the Lorentz interval is 0. So Gilbert Lewis, famous chemist who invented the Lewis dot diagram, wrote a couple of papers in the 30s about this idea that we're essentially in virtual contact with anything that is any source of light, because the light that is being emitted from its starting point is arriving at the end point, but that's only from our reference frame. From its actual evolution, there's no distinction between those two events. So I think this is an interesting thought experiment that I'm not sure, maybe other folks have got some answers to how this is viewed, but that there's not a distinction between the events of emission and absorption when one considers that the light-like interval, or the null interval that's being traveled by light, doesn't have any real sense in which time. I think one could say the proper time is 0, although I'm not sure that's the right statement. No, that's not the right statement. But the Lorentz interval is 0. So can we say, for instance, a question that might be asked is there a causal ordering of light leaving the sun and light arriving at Earth when those two events are really not separate or distinct events from the point of view of a light-like interval? And so maybe there's no answer to this, but it's a thought experiment that I'm not sure has been achieved or answered completely, and points to the question of what is time, or ordering in time.
Thank you, Sky, and Eric before him. Anyone, and Sky, thank you for the consciousness raising point here about making sure we include diversity in our people that we encourage to speak in the room. So I'd like to encourage other people on the room, especially people, ladies that are in the room here, and anyone who hasn't spoken yet, to contribute with a question or a statement they would like to make. So
Paul,
anyone?
before you go there, do you mind if I just quickly address Sky's question? Because I think there is something to be addressed over there.
Yes, please do that. And I'll be monitoring for people flashing the microphone at the bottom of this list. Go ahead.
Hi. So in the proposed thought experiment, you're treating two events, say an emission of a photon and its interaction with the target destination, as identical in a light-like interval. But you cannot ignore position in a light-like interval. In a light-like interval, you can perhaps say that time in that frame is not operating, but you're still moving in space. So in that 4-vector, because you see a 4-vector has to be preserved, that's the basic of a Lorentz transform that works in Minkowski space, is you have the 4-vector as invariant. And in a light-like interval, you have to consider space. So when you say those two events are identical, you cannot have those two events being identical simply on the basis that they happen in different places. So another thought experiment to counter that example would be, hey, a photon gets emitted at the sun, and now that's one event. Now it may have an event where it interacts with a polarizer, which nullifies it entirely, and it may interact with, say, a polarizer which has a 50% chance of it transmitting. Now, in the thought experiment Sky proposes, the creation of it and a 50% or 0% probability of it moving through this polarizer operator, which changes based on its rotation matrix, those would be indistinguishable. However, that's not physical. And a reason we know it's not physical is in a more theoretical framework that in a light-like interval, you cannot ignore position, because position is the one thing that changes in your 4-vector. The 4-vector being, CT, X, Y, Z.
Well, both the position and time change from an inertial reference frame, like me sitting on Earth. But the point being that in the asymptotic limit of time dilation and space contraction, that those measures go to 0 or become.
Space contraction would refer to the length of the object with respect to the axis in which it is moving. Space contraction would not refer to the displacement between point X and point X2.
The displacement of the surrounding environment along the direction of motion would be contracted, or the length of the displacement along this.
It would happen to the stuff that is moving at that velocity relative to something which is at rest in a different frame. So say I have a spaceship, right, moving at the speed of light from A to B, suppose that was possible. Now, I'm not saying that the distance between A and B would go to 0, though the speed in which the time between that would go to zero, what would happen is that the length of the spaceship would change in a frame of someone outside the spaceship. So in your case, when there's a single photon, one might argue that if we assume a photon is a point particle, and that's a very interesting question because, as you can imagine, a wave function cannot be normalized to have a point particle behavior while also being correct over there, because the probability won't go to one over there, because probability goes to one over there. If you integrate over all space, it goes to infinite. So what happens is you have a mess up with a bit of a, you have to have some form of position uncertainty for any particle. That's why you don't exactly have point particles. So let's say you have a point particle, which is not exactly point particle, but has length, say dx, in the direction in which it is moving, being the x-axis. So over there, the length contraction would happen of dx, but not of your displacement in the x-axis, if that makes sense.
Well, if I have a measuring stick that's the length of the distance between the sun and the earth, and I'm the photon, then I would see that measuring stick get shorter. Or if I'm traveling fast, let's say, I would see that measuring stick get shorter, and I would see the time slow down. But the measuring
Yes
stick
and
between me
no.
and the sun would, or between me and the earth, would get shorter. Yes.
Okay, so say you're a photon, right, and there's a measuring stick in front of you.
Well, let's say
Now,
I'm a very fast moving cosmic ray, for instance.
now say you're very fast. Now you'll traverse the length of that stick in what will feel like almost no time to you. In fact, you may see it as no time if you're actually approaching C. However, let's take a snapshot of this. Let's take a snapshot that right before we on the measuring stick, let's imagine what someone from the spaceship might see. And they will see along, okay, let's say you're moving along the x-axis and you're looking down, right? So the person has some height. Let's put this height on the y-axis. Let this height be dy, and you're moving along the x-axis. Now, say the measuring stick starts at point A on the x-axis and ends at point B on the x-axis. So now you will draw two lines. One will go from dy 0 comma dy to A comma 0. One will go from 0 comma dy to B comma 0. And in between these, you will have an angle, right? A theta. So much like, say, I look up a building, I will see the building is of a certain angular length in my vision. Similarly, this measuring stick will be of a certain angular length in your path of traversal. Now, whether I'm going slow or whether I'm going fast, when I see this measuring stick, to what extent does its angle change? And you will see that no matter how fast you go, the angle will never go to zero, because at some snapshot, you will see there's an angular displacement over there. Assuming you can actually see a snapshot, yes.
Keshav, could you also just, perhaps this is an easier way to put it, is that the measuring stick itself would have some sort of orthogonal vector that has like a Lorentz boost applied to it. As a result of that, you could see the angle change.
I'm not sure how to convey this because I really I'm not trained to communicate this. I'm trained to solve these problems, which is honestly simpler. Is what I would say
It's not
is
easy.
we define a Lorentz space as a region in which you can have these invariance of the Lorentz transform where the 4 vector is conserved. And the 4 vector being conserved means that you cannot exactly have the displacement go to 0, because if you do so, if you try to imagine the lines, right? So say if you have Minkowski space, and now the faster you go, the more, the less of an angular separation there is between your two lines, which are mirrored about the mirrored about the line of your velocity equal to c. And despite you doing that, no matter how close you get to it, and when you finally get to like a light-like state, right, where you're approaching c, you will still notice that in your 4 vector, your displacement is changing, and if your time doesn't.
Yeah, a lot of this is just I think like an easier way to say that the metric signature in some sort of Lorentzian manifold is that like invariant angle change, right? I think that's like the easiest way to put this mathematically.
I guess I wasn't thinking of there being an angle because I wasn't considering the height of the observer. I was considering that the observer was looking directly ahead along the x-axis, so I wasn't considering a y coordinate at all. Is that something you're saying is essential in this discussion?
No, it's useful to visualize it, but the mathematical form is using manifolds as Josh describes it. Now, I do not use that language because I've not officially taken differential geometry. I've only done it for physics. So I hesitate to use a mathematical construct I cannot define as rigorously as I would in a math class. But simultaneously, I think whatever I mentioned to you about that is an instantiation of the abstract notion, and it's in a form that is easier to visualize. but the notion of Lorentz invariance would hold in a more general space.
Well, thank you very much for the feedback. I'll have to go back and think a little bit more and maybe be in touch. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I am going to
Fantastic
go to.
question.
Yes, really great question. This has been a wonderful room. So just let me remind everyone, this is my experiment earlier on this evening to start a room because I'm planning on producing or creating a club that has a regular weekly meeting on this topic, the nature of time. I was just experimenting this evening to create a room to see if I could understand the UI and the where this app works, and to be prepared to moderate if necessary. And then this room turned into something much bigger than I ever expected. So this is the first room that I've ever created, and I find Clubhouse to be an absolutely fascinating app, being able to create such high quality, incredible conversations in such a short period of time. And I'm delighted that everyone joined us this evening. And thank you, everyone from Alex and Eric and Sky and Zach and all the other people who've given us such a fantastic evening. I'm going to go. I'm going to sleep right now. I do have to be up in the morning and do a job. So I'm hoping the other moderators that I've left in the room are going to be able to continue with the room. It seems like it's a really excellent room. So thank you, everyone. Who would like to go next? Do you have a question or a contribution you'd like to
Hi,
make?
Paul. Hi, Paul. It's David. I'd like to. I'm in the fifth row, and I'd just like to say thank you so much. I think I've been in this room almost since the beginning. I think it's a great room, and I'd obviously suggest that everyone that's in here, the 1,000+ people that have been here, follow Paul's club once it's created. The only comment I'd like to make, and I'm also getting very tired because I've been in here as long as you have, Paul, is I'm wondering about the name of the club, and I think a few other people have mentioned this, being the nature of time. I think that's certainly great for the rooms, but as a number of people have pointed to, the space-time connection ever since Einstein 1905 and in quantum mechanics and in quantum gravity, they're so intimately connected that the conversation keeps drifting to both. I know you have a particular purpose in terms of your own work, and clearly everyone in the room is getting a lot of benefit out of it, but I'm just wondering whether you can have a room on time without making it about space-time. I'm David, I'm done speaking, and I'm very thankful for the room that you've created, and congratulations on such a success for your very first room.
So David, thank you. That's a great concept. So I'm totally open to what the name of this new room should be. I've had suggestions that it should be a broader title. Tonight's naming was purely an experiment, so thank you. So David, do you have an explicit suggestion of what the room should be named? You mentioned that it should be more like time rather than space-time, but do you have an example you'd like to contribute?
No, there are better minds in this room to do it, but I do notice that, and a couple of people mentioned earlier when Amanda asked about resources, I've been reading Carlo Rovelli's books, and I mean, ever since Einstein, space-time seems to be the combining feature, even though the theories have changed dramatically. This connection, this intimate connection between space and time, in the same way as electricity and magnetism seems to be inescapable. So something connecting space and time would be my suggestion. Thank you.
All right, let me go away and think about that, and see what I can come up with. In the meantime, I'm going to
Paul, I know you need to get going. I don't want you to feel like you have to stay up all night here. We can bring some new voices in here.
Sky, why don't you go ahead and help me take over by moderating with some new voices? Go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Really appreciate you making this happen. And everybody else on stage, BA, Cami, Hanson, Aneep, Sean, and all the other folks on stage. Do we have a woman or female who would like to join with a comment or a question? Maybe we can alternate between male and female voices.
Scott, I don't know if that's like a productive way to go about it. I think if people just want to chime in, they should just, chime in.
Yeah, that's cool. That's great. What do we have?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think
a person needs to speak based on their sex, but I did have a comment for you, Sky, from a couple hours ago, with respect to the microstates, when you were first thinking about, like, I guess the moments right after the Big Bang. Is that what you were talking about? Yeah, I think I would go back and consider the principle of Landau's dampening, and also I do actually think that what oh, did he leave already? Zach was talking about, no, not, it wasn't Zach, it's Jeffrey, with respect to considerations of a state change. So you're having a situation where you're at a very low entropy, and I think in the situation there that Landau's dampening principle would apply, and then you're in a state for maybe an indefinite period where you're basically having a situation where you're in a microstate of the change in microstates will be very near equilibrium for quite some time, if and so that we actually don't have a definition of time as of yet, but after a certain amount of kind of these like incremental states of that are near equilibrium, there will be after an enormous amount of, quote, timelessness, I guess, in that sense, because the arrow of time hasn't yet been manufactured to be unidirectional, or yeah, there will be at some given time after, like, the summation of I guess the path integrals of, like, possible future states, you will move into a phase change, and that is probably where the emergence of, like, time and space, I guess, that's where it would start to form. So I think Paul's gonna have some more room. Oh, here he left. Paul's gonna have some more rooms on this, but maybe that's something you can look into. Oh, and so also what Alex was saying with respect to looking into, like, the matrices, if that I think that will be the math as well that would be involved.
Yeah. The matrices I think he was specifically referring to were a very specialized type of S matrix. If you take a look at S matrices and DSCFT space, that's kind of an interesting way to approach this problem as well.
Also, I think Sky mentioned a few resources. Honestly, in case you're interested in relativity, the best resource is either OCW, that's MIT OpenCourseWare, or Landau-Lifshitz. So Landau-Lifshitz is kind of an old book. It's kind of hardcore, but if you get through Landau-Lifshitz, you'll know your stuff. You'll be really confident. And it's also the book used by my TA who was hired by Google, so he was doing something right.
I second that.
So I need to hop out in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to say how much I got from this, and I guess you heard from me that I take a kind of a somewhat meta approach. I think about the human cognition. What is it that makes us sometimes, in some situations, able to make these kind of ridiculous leaps of insight? And can we create the kind of collaborative conditions and the kind of creative playfulness, but combined with this incredible rigor and sensitivity to the conceptual structures that are going on in our minds? So that's like the thing that I obsess over all day, every day with KK. So if anyone wants to kind of connect with me on that, do please DM me. My DMs on Twitter are open. See you all soon.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
So I wanted to just quickly chime in because Alex and Zach were here, and they're both So Zapp's I mean, he's a high energy physics theorist, but his primary work is in applying, talking about string theory. And Alex is a string theory, like a young budding string theorist as well. And Eric had mentioned, he primarily talks about his criticisms of string theory, but he occasionally mentioned loop quantum gravity as I think one of the few crazy people who spends his time researching in loop quantum gravity. I mean, I just want to provide a little bit of my perspective on it. I mean, it's pretty much similar to Alex's, but I think, one of the founders of the theory himself, Lee Smolin, who's a perimeter right now, which is where funnily enough, Alex and Zach both spent some time at, believes that, he thinks that loop quantum gravity and string theory can be, there is this commonality between them such that they can, create this like conjoined definition of space-time together. Um, it, it's a bit strange to think about just because they're so diametrically opposed. And Alex and I have had some conversations about realizing that, I think some parts of space-time can be explained by strings and others by spin foams. But it, I mean, the problem of time is really difficult, and at least from my perspective, one of the more interesting revelations in loop quantum gravity is that while we don't have a Hamiltonian, what we could do is, in order to understand the time evolution of some spin network, what we can do is kind of apply these you apply these like orthogonal like Wick rotations to these planar graphs that we use to represent these spin networks. And very similarly, in ADS-CFT, that's a very there's a link there to entanglement entropy within ADS-CFT, and while that connection has not been fully borne out yet, it could be an interesting link between linking both of these very diametrically opposed theories of quantum gravity. So, it's a very difficult problem. I mean, I think there are a few people who would say the problem of time is less difficult than the problem of space, but it seems to be more on the fact that whenever we apply some sort of perturbative method, whether it be to quantum field theory, uh, even like topological quantum field theory or something like that, where you're dealing far more with what is happening within the space as opposed to the space itself, applying any sort of perturbative method often puts you at some sort of, not necessarily disadvantage, but it just makes it that much more difficult to understand why time iterates the way it does.
Could you just repeat the use case in about the time iterating? I missed the last piece there.
No, I mean, I was just saying that anytime you apply some sort of perturbative method of analyzing some problem in quantum field theory or ADS-CFT, or even just applying some sort of spin foam or spin network in some geometric dimension, um, every time you use a perturbative method, you're often forced into some sort of path integral formulation, which makes you dependent on some sort of Lagrangian, right? And there are interesting programs within string theory that are trying to solve this problem by getting rid of the Lagrangian altogether. I'm not fully opposed to it. It's actually called the conformal bootstrap program, where you look at things in terms of scale invariant purposes, as opposed to directly using the Lagrangian. But every time you use some sort of perturbative method, you're almost always locked into a framework where you have to iterate time in a certain manner, as opposed to take things at some sort of time invariant scales,
Yeah.
which makes the problem that much more difficult to solve. I'm not completely against it. I'm just saying that this is the reason why that time is such a difficult problem. And if you're going to link loop quantum gravity and string theory together, which I think may end up being kind of our solution to all of this, you're going to have to find some sort of way to link them together without using the Lagrangians.
Yeah, well, I'll just expand on that a little bit for something I've examined more recently, the time-dependent Schrodinger equation. For folks out there who are not as familiar, the time-independent Schrodinger equation is a a straightforward eigenvalue problem. But when the Hamiltonian is time dependent, you have to iterate the integral over time. So you have an integral of the perturbing potential over time. You're integrating the Schrodinger equation, the perturbation of the Schrodinger equation. But that's just the first order. And if you want to get the second order, you have to integrate inside that integral. And the limits of integration of your inner integral are become the integral, or the parameter of integration of the outer integral. It forms the limits of integration of the inner integral. And so you've got this nested set of integrals that just goes on as far as you want to estimate, out to whatever order you want to estimate. And so something that's interesting there that I think, trying to remember his name,